fifth grade. Really ain't no difference if that nigga gay.
Blood satellite.
So you have to ask, like, who is the American? What is the American? And what is that American going to do? Because black people have no opinion. You have to understand that. Like, there's still black. Most other. This will sound like I'm reaching here. I generally don't think most non-whites even understand what's happening. I still, to this day, see black people. They're wearing masks, but the masks are on their chin. I'm like, you don't know what's going on.
Yeah,
you don't know what any of this was. You kind of get
that's not a stable position. Like, you're wearing it or you're not wearing it. If you're doing that, like, that's not. It's like you're wearing. It's a third party thing almost. Like, you're not even wearing the uniform correctly.
You just didn't question this thing, like Indians. Every fucking buddy, everyone's just like, yeah, this is what we're doing now. It was. And look at the people who are getting in trouble for pushing back. It's all white people. You know, black people didn't get vaccinated. But that's not because they had a fucking moral political stance on it. They just didn't want to do it for the same reason they don't want to do a lot of other shit. Any time you let them go on their own, I just don't want to pay for this thing today. That's it. Like, there's no other higher order decision making going on. So you have to say, like, who's actually morally or intellectually or ideologically pushing back on this is pretty much this white American class holding the torch of, you know, not even just rebellion, independence, liberty, just the stuff that is the DNA of America. And that's kind of, you know, that leads into a book that I had read recently that I found really fascinating. Let me just reach for it here. The book is titled The Construction of Nationhood, Ethnicity, Religion, and Nationalism by Adrian Hastings. And that might seem like a clumsy segue. It's not. It's these things start to wonder, like I just said, you wonder about like, what is an actual nation? Is it just the state? Because the state seems to be failing. The state in Canada seems to be failing in a lot of different ways. Let's use Canada as an example. This is when we talk about the trucker convoy protest. I think what that did was it revealed how toothless the state was, how it cannot really command any of its resources or its personnel to stop what were just a bunch of fucking conservative guys mucking about and causing problems. Like, they would have loved to send in the military. We just don't have a good one. They just couldn't do it. So the state itself is pretty weak. The Canadian state apparatus is pretty ineffective, and it's, you know, it just doesn't work properly. And people on the outside think, you know, Canadian healthcare is free. Canadian healthcare is a fucking death sentence. Do not get me started on that.
Yeah.
But then it thinks, okay, well, what is the nation if not the state? You know, and it makes you wonder, like, if the state were to fall, what remains? I remember when we were talking about the book Democracy, the God That Failed by Hans Hermann Hoppe. There's this part at the end that I really liked. And this was very libertarian in his thinking. And I thought he redeemed a lot of libertarian thought when he was talking about this. But he said, you know, once the state falls, what remains is the people. And that, you know, once Rome falls, who are the people among the ruins? How does that become Italians, essentially? So it's like, outside of the machinery of the state, you do have these people, and they kind of make their own rules. There's a sense of anarchy, but that anarchy leads to hierarchy, and then that's where you get the family. That's where you get communities. That once this big, powerful apparatus falls, like, what's the real heart of the nation? And so this was an interesting book because it's written by Adrian Hastings, who is, from what I can tell reading it, he's a pretty liberal guy. This was almost a nationalist apologetic, that he was a guy coming from sort of multicultural, multi-ethnic liberalism, but he's trying to redeem this concept of the nation against these modern writers who want to say, you know, this nation, this thing called a nation state is just this new thing we invented in the 19th century. And that because it's just invented out of whole cloth, it has no relevance to the modern world. We don't need nations anymore. We can live in a post-nation world, which is what Canada's Justin Trudeau really believes. But Mr. Hastings was saying, no. the concept of the nation goes back even further. It's not just a construct of the state. It's not just borders. It's not just the bureaucracy, which is what people think when they hear about what a nation is, or it's not a country, as it were. So he says, like, while nations are a modern concept, they have a lot of parallels with medieval thought. So he traces the concept of a nation back to medieval Europe, which is what no one believes. Everyone thinks that they like to think back then. It's like, oh, there was ethnicities and there's kingdoms, there was monarchies, but there was no such thing as a nation. Not true. And he uses a few examples to prove this. He focuses a lot on Britain, but he also talks about Germany. He talks about France. He says the modern nation it's articulated the most accurately in Britain, but he also shows examples from Africa as well. And also, you could, if you want to, use Aboriginals in Canada as another example. I'll get into that in a second, but it's about how this idea of a united people that kind of function like a nation, even alongside of a state, but it's almost that they gave birth to the state apparatus. So you have the nation predating the state. It wasn't that you just have this political machine that just fills itself with people. So he says modern nations take the prototype of England, which existed in pre-Enlightenment. He says as early as the 14th century, we see nations being the word nation refers to a group of defined people linked to land. And he also mentions, his thing, and some people might disagree with this, but his thing, I kind of agree with it, is that religion sits at the center of any proper nationalist project, even going back hundreds and hundreds of years. And he says, one of the earliest depictions of a nation is Israel. You would say what you want about that, but like, what is Israel in the Bible? Israel is a people, it's a culture, it's a land, the idea of Israel exists now as it kind of existed back then. But that's to show you that, look, we had this idea of what a nation is for hundreds and hundreds, thousands of years. So you can't just say it's a modern thing. And by which I mean nation, a people united by government, language, and customs. So he says he defines a nation in 4 ways. He says a nation must have 4 things to be considered a nation. And I believe this. He says it must have an extensively used vernacular literature. So you have to have a common language, right? You have to have a common language that everyone speaks, and also it must be depicted in the written word, and you must have your own literature. And throughout the book, you'll say there's a lot of ethnicities that never become nations. You become a nation once you're organized. So the English were nations, and he gives examples in Africa that were nations. A lot of them just remain ethnicities. You're a type of person, and maybe you have a spoken language, but you don't have that extra uniting force. And he makes the point that to have that unity, you need literature. You need books that tell your own story, that tell your own mythology, and most importantly, the literature. And I would argue that this is still relevant now. I think you need literature, not just movies, not just music, but like literature and tomes doing this. He says it allows people to imagine themselves as united. It's not just a coincidence. You are a part of a story. And if you can imagine yourself as part of a story, that is crucial. Now, he also says you need 1 or more ethnicities with strong cultural bonds. Now, some people will hear that and think, oh my God, this is a multicultural thing. Not necessarily, because the British people, as we know them now, started off as multiple ethnicities. There was the Normans and there was a few others, and they kind of became what are now the English people. But if you go back, and when we talked about the history of the kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth, even that story, as mythological as it was talking about, there was 3 kind of groups that were pretty similar, but very distinct. They had distinct languages, but they could kind of coexist together, and over time they go together. But the point is that you have to have strong cultural bonds as 1 or more ethnicities. So you could not, for example, have, the Normans next to the Indians. They would not go together, which is what we're seeing now. He says that's why he says a nation is a more self-conscious entity than an ethnicity. And here's what the most important part that I want to get to. A nation has a horizontal structure where people are not just territorial subjects of the state and people have a similar character. So it's that horizontality that means something. So this is why he explains in the book that France struggled so long to become this sort of nation, because it was, the monarchy was stronger in France than it ever really was in Britain. And you know what? I'll get into this now because he gives a few examples. So there's Britain, that's kind of like the perfect example of a nation. France had a rockier go of it because it had such a strong monarchy, and that eventually fell. This led eventually to the French Revolution. But he gives the example of Germany. Germany is fascinating because the Germans never really had a monarchy. They never had a huge state apparatus as such as France did. But what they had was ethnicity, and they had a purity of ethnicity. And he mentions this in the book. He says that, you know, the German people, even without a state, had a strong sense of their borders and who they were and their ethnicity and their literature and their culture and everything. And he said they actually came at a nation from the opposite way. So France came at a modern nation from one direction, which was supreme monarchy authority, which dissolved over time. Germany came at it, it kind of built this state, this modern nation state, just from the ethnicity. But that's why both of these nations have radically different character. And if you look at, you know, not to go down this road with the Third Reich, but it's like that's why Germany always had such a unique claim to ethnic purity, because for all intents and purposes, they had it. You know, the French, as we know them, were always kind of an amalgamation of similar but different ethnicities. Same with Britain, arguably the same with Spain. And there's long histories about this. Eastern Europe's an even bigger mess, frankly. But Germany was distinct, that they could really be a distinctly ethno-nationalist nation, which means that this sort of thing can exist without any sort of government at all. And that's what I found very interesting. And I think that's true. He gives a lot of evidence in this. I'm kind of glossing over it right now, but that's three examples of how you kind of approach the modern state from three different directions. He also makes a claim, and this is, I guess, the fourth thing, that nations and nationalism as a concept were introduced in the Bible and would not exist without it. Now, I know maybe there's some wiggle room on that, because if we want to talk about the Scandinavians, if we want to talk about things, he very strongly claims that without the Bible, there would not be the modern nation state as it was pioneered by Britain. And Britain really, to their mind, sits at the heart of this, because it was a lot, and we covered this last episode, that a lot of what was going on in Britain inspired the French Revolution. And he makes a claim that the thing about the modern nation that's interesting is it is that perfect marriage of a defined people and also a state that is balanced with them. There's not this huge gap between the people and the monarchy. So that's what was so interesting about the development of Britain, is that it really did develop a bit more horizontally, or there was less difference between the ruling class and the regular class, or the martial class, as we outlined when we talked about The Law of Civilization and Decay by Brooks Adams, that even historically in Rome, like the idea of the rulers and the ruled wasn't there. You had like the people who were simultaneously farmers and soldiers, and you had kind of landlords, but it wasn't so stark. And then as you develop into a nation, it inspires other places and ethnicities around you to become nations. And the example he gave was Ireland. Like Ireland also had a language, they were an ethnicity, they had very distinct borders, but he says they never reached that next level of being a distinct nation. They're even still fighting for it now. That's why you still see Irish nationalist movements, but the problem is that he traces this back to like one or two specific incidents, but he said this is why the Bible was so important, because the fact that the Bible in Ireland was not translated into Gaelic or Celtic or whatever it is, and it wasn't English, it kind of imposed Englishness on them, and because it had its like central religion in the English language and its proximity to England, it was essentially absorbed into England. And that's why to this day you still have them trying to fight that. But it's, you know, there are claims to be made that you're not that different. Maybe you're just in the process of being amalgamated in the English people, but you've just been fighting it for so long. But that's why he said, like, even Ireland, but Ireland has to try and essentially be its own Britain to fight against Britain. And that's the trend you see, that as Britain develops this new sort of modern nationhood, its enemies need to do the same, because it turns out that's just a great way to organize yourself, to coordinate resources and get people together to do things. And like I said before, a language sits at the center of that, like I was just saying, and that's why the movement from an oral vernacular to a written vernacular becomes more advanced, and that's why nation building is so effective, not effectively, but it's so accomplished or attempted by the English world. Because if you can go in to like a place that doesn't have a written language, it proves phenomenally easy to dominate them culturally. I think this is in a way what happens with the Aboriginals in Canada. Because if you look at the Aboriginals here, it's kind of interesting because, okay, they have an ethnicity, they had a language, but they never had a written language. And so even though they call themselves nations, they never actually achieved full nationhood. Even now, they're not nations. They just call themselves that. And in Canada, they never had a written language. They never had that true uniting force. And I would argue that they still don't have it. And in Canada, I believe we had to essentially invent a written language for them in the 90s, because we have like Aboriginal writing on fucking signposts now if you go to these areas, but they never had a written language. And so I think they're a fantastic case where, as much as they want to talk like they are a nation, they never had that ability to coordinate at that higher level. So they never actually were nations. And we can see evidence of them all over the fucking world. But that's one way that this other dominant actual nation was able to come in and coordinate so well. It wasn't just through violence. It was just that the English and the Europeans possessed more unity and effectiveness than the Aboriginals could. It was like fucking, a modern computer compared to an old one. Like, you just can't compete at any single level. And that's why but because they are a distinct ethnicity, they can never be absorbed. So they're just stuck in this state forever. Hold on. And he says, what's interesting is a nation does not need everyone to believe it exists. You just need a core group of people who really believe it exists, and then the people have a general horizontal kinship. And this is what we saw when we covered Ukrainian history not long ago. We covered a book about tracing the Ukrainian national project going back a long, long time. There's a lot of people who think that Ukraine's an American invention. It is not. Ukrainian nationalism has a long and pretty violent and sordid history. But like all nationalist projects, it's enacted by kind of a core intelligentsia. There's this group of people, this group of nationalists who start crafting this mythology. And you can weld that pretty easily onto an ethnicity. So the Ukrainian ethnicity, the Slavs, whatever they were, they had their folklore, they had their language and everything. And then all you need is like a core group of people to elevate that to nationhood and for them to go along with it. That's really all you need. And for those people to believe in it and to kind of elevate everyone else, that's all you need. You don't even need everyone to be a patriot. Because not everyone in America was ever a patriot. There was a few. But when they say, oh, people just wanted to be farmers, that is true. And then the kinship and the ethnic stuff kind of went without saying. You never had to be an ethno-nationalist in America because it just went without saying. That was just normal. And at that same time, you can also have a breakaway ethnicity form within a nation. And this is where people start to perk up. Like, can you have an ethnogenesis? Well, yeah, as long as you follow the rules. So what are the rules? Well, if you are a group of people, let's say you're in Canada, let's say you are in America, and you are a patriot, you can trace your lineage back to the Mayflower, whatever it might be. As long as you have land as long as you have your own little economy to just prevent state strangulation, as long as you have literacy, as long as you have your own literature telling your own story, as long as you have a horizontal awareness and a kinship like that, and that's really all you need. And that's kind of the main takeaway from the book that's so interesting. It's like, well, what is a nation? It's a nation is a group of people that just believe they're a nation. That's it. That's all a fucking nation is. Everything else is on top of that just to ensure its survival. A state and bureaucratic apparatus is there just to serve the people, ideally. But absent that, if the state were to fall, that nation would still exist. And all you need is the people to believe they're a nation. Now, how you get people to believe you're a nation, we have covered. But it's really nothing more than that. So when people talk about, ethno-nationalist projects, let's use black people in America. If you want to get away from accusations of white supremacy, black people in America are a fantastic real-time way we can see this happening. Black people are producing tons and tons of Afrocentric literature. They have their own, debatable if they're Christian, but even with the Nation of Islam, that's got a pretty strong argument to be there, uniting ethnic. And actually, the Nation of Islam is great because even if not everyone is a Nation of Islam member, there's enough of them that their rhetoric has seeded throughout the Black American community. So you might be on the fringes of Black nationalism if you are just a Black person, no matter what you want to do, unless you're like a fucking Candace Owens or something. But then you're either a novelty to us or a freak to them. So that's not even a good way to want to live. But if you want evidence of this, look at Black people are actually doing a pretty good job of an ethno-nationalist project. And we might complain about it because we don't like it. We don't like them. We don't like what they say or how they treat us. But technically, that's a pretty good example. And as a result, they wield a significant amount of power. And I would argue they have become more of an effective nation by this definition than even white people. Because Black people can probably coordinate a lot better. And the white people who want to coordinate are turned on by other white people. That's the problem that we face. Like, if we want to march for our rights, most of the people throwing trash at it. What the fuck was Charlottesville? Charlottesville was effectively what I'm talking about, and it was all fucking whites and Jews, but a lot of whites, like smashing them, threatening them, saying "go die." So like, Black people don't fucking get that. So I'm not saying, be like them. I'm just saying these are examples of why things are the way they are, because we are not any sort of people right now, and that must be resolved for anything. And like I said, it is possible. You really just need to believe, and once you believe, you'll start kind of separating on your own, which is what people are doing right now. And that's what Hispanics are doing as well. They're like a new type of guy. You're the modern Hispanic person, a mestizo. Like they're new, but they're doing a fucking better job of it, but this is where the book, at its core, is also written by a liberal guy. So by the end of the book, after he explains the story of nationalism, why it's valuable, that's why he says a multi-ethnic nationalism is healthier than multinational nationalism. So what we might say, especially if you're a Duganist, if you're a multipolar type person, you would say, okay, so we should all be ethno-nationalists and have your nations. He's saying, no. We should be ethno-nationalists within the same nation. So for him, what's going on in America is kind of the perfect representation of what he wants. So I look at that and say, well, no, that's horrible. Or Canada would be a better example. Like, yeah, Canada, like you have your ethnicity, you have your self-determination, but you don't have a military, you don't have borders that you defend. We'll just allow you to have this lower level type of nationalism. So just to be upfront, that is what he's arguing for. So I don't necessarily agree with that. However, that is a reality that people might have to live in, where if you are a dissident in North America right now, or even various places in Europe, you might have to sit down and ask, okay, what is our nation? And you can't say country, you can't say state. What is the European American? What is, as Dr. Ricardo Duchesne would say, the Euro Canadian? What is the Euro Canadian? What does he look? What does he believe in? And we talked about Albion Sea, that great book. It breaks down what a folk is. There's like 40 fucking check boxes you can talk about. Like, what is a folk? What's your religion? What's your, how do you dress? How do you build your houses? How do you raise your kids? What are your marriage rules? If you can answer those questions, you can start. But I think what I'm trying to get at is you might need to start the conversation at bedrock and then ask these. Don't take anything as assumed. Assume nothing here. There is no, like white nation right now unless you start really questioning, like, well, do we actually have that? It even says, like, back in the day, because he's tracing this to medieval Europe, especially Britain, he says, like, the traditional state didn't even infringe on the day-to-day lives of the people. They left it to themselves. And the French monarchy was actually a good example of this. Even though there was a monarchy, a lot of libertarians point back to this, like, oh, back then the state didn't, control people. There was it was a small government. That's what they'll say. Kind of right, kind of wrong. But the reason you could have a small government was because the government grew like a branch, or a canopy rather, from the trunk of the tree of the nation. It wasn't just this bureaucracy that you fill with people, which is how Canada treats itself. He gives some examples here. I'll just rattle off. He says, even prior to Britain as a political entity, Britain was united ecclesiastically as early as the 750s. In France and Scotland, the kingdom preceded the nation of people, reflected in how they did their saints, because they did saints differently. That's actually an interesting way of looking at it. Did you have sort of like aristocratic saints, or did you have saints of the people? So he said, but in Britain, the people comes beyond it. And so in that sense, the Magna Carta was only codifying what was already there. And people will talk about the Magna Carta like it was a lightning bolt coming down from the sky. Like, one day we just invented the law. It's like, no, the Magna Carta was just writing it the fuck down, but it was there, and even in the Magna Carta, they refer to it as the English nation, right? He says, like I was saying before, in the 11th to the 14th centuries, it was English nationalism of conquest that triggered Scottish nationalism to repel it, which is to say the existence of Britain nationalism forced others around it to catch up. And, in that same way, like Scotland, that was what the French Revolution was. The French Revolution was interesting because the French could look abroad and see this sort of more horizontal nation. What they were trying to do was make France more horizontal, basically. We're going to have the people. This is where the idea of the political capital P, people, come from. And interestingly, it was the French during the Revolution who were saying that Britain wasn't living up to its national promise. Like, France was essentially saying, we're doing nationhood better than you, and we hate you. And then comes Napoleon. Napoleon is kind of like, no, I'm going to show you guys how to do nationalism. I'm going to come by and kill all the people in charge, and then get the people all riled up and stuff like that. Another thing about Britain that was unique, if you look at how Britain was grown, was so France had the idea of the monarchy and that structure, but Britain had what was called the Shire system. And the Shire system was more like municipal. So it was this idea that the government, there wasn't like a king and then his like subjects. They had these like communities and these villages, and the villages would come together. And this is kind of how they rebuilt it in America later, because America is really just a clone of Britain. But you saw like more municipal government. You saw smaller leaders that would eventually build up to what we know as the modern parliamentary system. But that's why it started on the village level, and they had their representatives, and those representatives would meet in these halls, and then those halls would go up to them, blah, blah, blah. And that's what places like Spain and France lacked. And I think that's an interesting way of looking at how you might model something like this, because even in the case of Britain, it started off on the village and town level. And later on, Britain was the first one to kind of get rid of that and graduate to the next thing. But that's how it started. He gives a couple, just so I'm not being too Eurocentric, he gives a couple of examples from Africa as well, because the same sort of thing was going on. He said this place called Buganda was one of the most likely opportunities for a nation state, because it had the most eagerness of adopting translated books. Like there were nations like Ethiopia was another one. But the thing that's interesting about them is, I guess we can end on this. Like, by the 15th century, most nations were pretty much set. All the big ones, as we know them now. There's obviously some conglomerations and some breaking aparts, especially with the Soviets and everything. But around the 15th century, pretty much everything ethnically and nationally was locked in. And in the later centuries, the problem was forcing everyone else to become nations. And I think this is where we are at right now. Because even he makes a claim in the book that most groupings in the world just aren't fit to become nations. Like I mentioned, the Aboriginals in Canada. Like, I don't think you're fit to become a nation. So there's a lot of places, and our problem, if we are Westo-centric, Britain's really bad at this, and because Britain's bad at it, so is America. Thinking that, everyone can be a nation. In fact, everyone should be a nation. In fact, that is what nation building is. It's going into these places that are just ethnically driven. A lot of places in Africa are like this. Like they don't have written language, and they don't really want one, or they don't have a central religion. They just exist on an ethnocentric basis. The problem we've always got into, especially in Britain, was saying, we'll help you build a nation from an ethnic standpoint. And what happens every single time is that's where genocides come from. You put the wrong ethnicity at the top, and the first thing they do is try and exterminate everyone else. So this idea of building nations is also something I would like to push back against, which is something he pushes back in the book too. Like, just don't try and force nationhood on ethnicities. It only ends in tears. Does that sound reasonable? What do you think about that?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Ethnicity sits at the heart of African nationalism. Even now, when you hear these African nations, it's almost like a parody. You'll see them like, we are the Democratic Republic of Congolese freedom fighters. Like, they are putting on the garb of nationalism. They're doing everything they should do. We got a capital city, because having a capital city is very important too. A lot of places don't have capital cities. They've just got a bunch of villages. So, we got a capital city now. We have some big buildings. Help us build big buildings. We have telephones now. But it seems that they can't admit that there's something missing there. And we keep banging our heads against the wall. Like, why don't these guys become nations and coordinate? Wouldn't that be easy? That'd be great if Africa could do that. But it's like, you just need to not bother, because it turns out that maybe nationhood is pretty rare. Yeah, and I think that's where the book ended off, and it wasn't like it wasn't trying to say they were lesser or subhuman in any way, but it did. This is a liberal guy saying that no, people suffer if you try and force nationhood. So I come away with that, like, okay, just leave them be. Let's do that. Let's just leave them be. Afghanistan, leave them be. And they complain about it too. They complain, you drew our borders. You gave the wrong guys the wrong. Okay, you know what? You're right. Bye. That's what it should be, right?
Yep.
And I guess that's all I had to end on. And that's the message I like to give to people. I'd recommend this book. Once again, it's the Construction of Nationhood, Ethnicity, Religion, and Nationalism. That nationalism, a nation, is really just an entity, a grouping of people that believes it's a nation. And there are certain prerequisites, most importantly, a written language that produces a unifying literature and also a central religion. This is also, circling back, this is when we were talking about the formation of modern Ukraine. This is what they did. And the story of Ukraine can be told not as some sort of evil American plan, but the creation of the Ukrainian Church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is kind of a hybrid of the Russian Eastern Orthodox Church and I believe it's Catholicism. But it is uniquely Ukrainian, and they needed a uniquely Ukrainian church to sit at the center of that Ukrainian identity. And the formation of that church was essentially what codified the Ukrainian people as something that can exist on their own. But even no matter what people think about Ukrainians, they like them, they don't like them, whatever. You can speak of this emotionlessly, and you could say we've seen nations within the last couple hundred years spring out of nowhere, and they have the same things in common. And it wasn't that you needed like everyone to believe it. You just had to have certain sort of ethnic prerequisites and cultural prerequisites. Anyway, so what do you think about that? Yay or nay? I know you're sick. Sorry.
No, it's all right. No, that's interesting. I guess I never really thought about it that much. I mean, putting it in the context of Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's like, yeah, of course they, that didn't turn out amicably, but the concept, like if you look at it that way, that in a lot of these cases, it's just that the actual fundamentally nationhood isn't even something that is applicable to most groups of people, and that's just something that we do. It's almost like, I don't want to say imperialism, but like, we have this expectation that everybody's like us, and then they're not even fucking close. I don't know why I think differently, but
and a lot of places that call themselves nations aren't really nations. Like, I hate to rag on the Aboriginals, but you're not really a nation. Not like, again, I come back to, I think Black Americans, African Americans, have been generating enough cultural capital to make a claim that if they wanted to, I think if Black people actually wanted to right now, they could do what Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam wanted to do and kind of make an ethno state for them. They just won't. But I think if they wanted to play that hand, they could. But I think it's interesting looking at other examples of even other African people. Like they adopt the language of nationalism, be taken seriously on the world stage, but they don't have any sort of power or coordination or any sort of cultural capital. But it's like we exist now in a world of nations. It is a nationalist world, but there's some nations that are imperial. There's some nations that call themselves nations, but they're not. They're just glorified, clumsy ethnicities. And once you see it like that, it makes a lot more sense. And once you realize, like, people say, oh, nations are just made up. It's like, yes, but that does not make them less powerful, because a bureaucracy is just made up too. And it's like, well, what is the state? They're like, well, the state has a monopoly on violence. Well, not always. It's only recently that happened. Like throughout, even in America. America is like the only nation in the world that still gets this. I'm fear that will go away. I think it's also lurking in Canada too, if they ever try and truly disarm Canada. But it's like, you don't actually have a nation unless it can defend itself. And I think there are ethnic groups that could make a claim for that. And I think if you are like a white person, think of like, do you have that horizontality to people, and do you have the ability to define yourself through violence? That's essentially what it is. Are you willing to resist an oppressor? Let's say it like that. And if no, well, you got to start working on that. And really all you need to do is just will it into existence. And if you do that, the fucking constitutions will just tumble out of you. All that other stuff will come after. And that's the claim he was making by tracing this all the way back to medieval Europe.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.